What's up? What's up, everyone? What's up? It's your boy Nick P, and y'all know me as the guy with the beard.
And it's your boy Rev Kev, here to engage, inform, and inspire. And if you're here to do that, then I guess we preaching to the choir.
Welcome to another meeting of the How to Be an Anti-Racist Book Club. I want to let you know for the third time, this is our third time together as co-facilitators. Maybe this is your first time with us. So I want you to know that my new co-facilitator is none other than my brother Rev Kev. He's a graduate of Gammon Theological Seminary. So we are going to be on this process of discovery and learning as we read how to be an anti-racist and co-facilitate this discussion together. Let us know in the comments if this is your first time watching us. Let us know where you're from. So if you're from Payne College, if you're from St. Luke United
Drop
Methodist
it in
Church,
the
Adwin,
chat.
Augusta, let us know right there in the chat. If you're from Gammon Theological Seminary at the Interdenominational Theological Center, let us know. Let us know if you're from Jackson State University, from the
Yeah.
Wesley Foundation there. Just let us know. Let us know how many times you've been with us. We want to hear from you.
All right. So we're going to be hopping into this brilliant book. If you haven't already, say this is your first time jumping on and you're trying to figure out what we're going to be doing. We're talking about this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's a great book. The author, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, is leading the country right now in talking about race and how to be anti-racist and how to do that work. And that's what you're here for. You're here to talk about this book. Whether you read it or whether you haven't read it, it's all good. We're here to learn together, engage together, and be in productive dialogue.
And we want to also thank our partners who are engaged, who helped this conversation to come about. So, our partners like St. Luke United Methodist Church in Augusta, Georgia.
Or the Jackson State University Wesley Foundation in Jackson, Mississippi.
Also, my company, my media company, Adwin Media LLC. And our school, let them know where
And
you
our
graduate.
school, Gammon Theological Seminary, a part of the ITC, the Interdenominational Theological Center, the only university like it is in its kind in Atlanta, Georgia.
And Rev Kev, he is actually a graduate of Gammon, and I am still a student. So I'm literally still learning. So I'm a theologue, and he's a theologian. So we're embarking on this journey of discovery at different points in our life. But we're going to transcend to another moment in our discussion called the San Copha Moment. And you might be wondering, what is San Copha mean? So San Copha is called an Adinkra symbol. It's a West African Adinkra symbol. Adinkra symbols are symbols like the symbol that Rev Kev is holding up. Also, the San Copha, there's another San Copha symbol that looks almost like a harp, like that. And what San Copha basically means is like how that bird is actually facing one direction, it's facing forward, but going back and fetching it. So as we move forward in life, there are still aspects of our life, whether a point that God was with you and spoke to you, maybe there was a point in your life where your theology shifted, maybe there was a book that you read that helped to develop your theology or your worldview. But what we're going to do in this San Copha moment is we're going to go back and reflect on all the chapters, briefly just go through a quick spiel on what all the chapters were about in case you are here for the first time or in case you missed one of our discussions. And Rev Kev is going to take it away.
All right. So we got a lot of chapters. So this is going to be kind of fast, but we know that you can keep up with us. So we're going over the first 9 chapters. The first chapter dealt with definitions. Definitions were very important because it lays the groundwork for how we will understand how the author is looking at these terms and framing everything that moves forward in the book. The definitions that stick out in this chapter are racist and anti-racist. What is a racist? A racist, as defined by this book, is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inactions or expressing racist ideas. An anti-racist is one who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions or expressing an anti-racist idea. Chapter 2, dual consciousness. Dual consciousness is kind of taken from W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of this double consciousness, and he breaks it down into how we have to navigate into different parts of society, what is acceptable, and then what might be normative for just your singular culture. But he breaks this down in three different ways. The first way is he has a title, what he terms assimilationist. This is one who is expressing racist ideas that one racial group is oppressed, but if they could just be more like us, then they would be better off. They're more progressive, but they're still racist. And then you have the segregationist, which flat out says that there is an inferiority of one culture and one race of people as opposed to another. And then an anti-racist is one who equally values culture, regardless of the status or history. Each culture has its value and its worth. You don't have to become like another culture, and you are not deemed inferior. Chapter 3 deals with power, race, and power. And how does race determine who gets what, where, and how? Race and power. Chapter 4 dealt with biology. How is the body incorporated in racism? So some people might say, well, because you are black, you have a smaller brain, but and the biology says this. Because your skin is dark, you are more prone to crime. How does biology play a part in racism and developing racist policies? Number number five Number 5 is ethnicity, because chapter 4 was biology. Number 5 is ethnicity. And then this is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead in inequity between racial groups. So we might have our own cultures, but are there these collective groups and policies that lead to these inequity amongst different groups? Chapter 6 deals with the body and is perceiving various things just based off of somebody's body in a particular presence. When you see Nick's beard, what restrictions or what access might that provide him? So thinking about the body and being in a particular presence, and how do we understand that? And then how do we kind of start dismantling those concepts? That's chapter 6. Chapter 7 deals with culture. And the author kind of talks about cultural racism, and he defines this as one who is creating a culture standard and imposing their culture on others as if there was a hierarchy. So my culture is better than yours. My music is better than yours. My this is better than yours. There's a cultural hierarchy. Number 8 is behavior. And then he talks about a behavioral racist and a behavioral anti-racist. A behavioral racist is one who is making individuals responsible for perceived behavior of racial groups and making racial groups responsible for the behaviors of an individual. Behaviors. Chapter 8 is very important for what we will be talking about tonight. Then number 9 dealt with color and colorism. And this is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequities between lighter people and darker people. Supported and they support racist ideas about light and dark and those type of inequities. And then so these are the things that we kind of talked about that lead us into where we are right now, chapter 10. So we go from color to talking about whiteness. And so this should be a very interesting conversation tonight, but that is our San Copha Moment, chapter 1 through 9.
Thank you so much, Rev Kev. I'm going to be honest with you. This chapter really made me think. All of them made me think, but this one made me think a little differently. The other ones made me think deep, but this made me kind of rethink a lot of things that we have been taught. But what he starts out with, again, he starts out his chapters with definitions, with a definition this time, just one. And he has coined a term called anti-white racist. This, he defines it by stating, one who is classifying people of European descent as biologically, culturally, or behaviorally inferior, or conflating the entire race of white people with racist power. So that's how he defines it. He actually he gives a anecdote like how all of his chapters. That's the writing style, that the engaging writing style that he offers, and he talks about how his college experience, um, how it began with a sense of hatred or a sense of anger. Um, and it was valid anger, but what he was offering, um, the nuance that he's offering is that it was a conflated sense of, he projected his anger in a conflated way. He blamed an entire people for certain people's evil, and he began to kind of espouse a perspective that was not anti-racist. He offers how the election of President George Bush, former President Bush, how um, so many black votes were purged, and he offered how that made him feel angry towards the entire white race. Um, and I don't think I don't think the anger is invalid towards white supremacy and towards racist power. But what he is offering is that his racial anger was directed towards an entire race. Um, so what did you feel about his narrative and some of the things that he was the notions that he was espousing?
So I think that there's a lot that is going on in this chapter. Like, so some of the things that he kind of talks about, he did talk about the election of George Bush. And in the midst of everything, he talks about how he is now at a HBCU and he's being able to learn about himself and his culture in such a way that is actually affirming him. And he said where he grew up, to learn about his culture was seen as a racist act. Like, so he goes from a place to where I don't want to be too proud of who I am because it can come off as offensive. And now he's in a place to where he's able to learn and hear different narratives as opposed to the things that he would have gotten back at home. And then it kind of culminates into this election of George Bush as Al Gore wins. But by the time they go to sleep, it's a recount, and they look up, and George Bush is getting another term, and he feels like, well, this is not just white supremacy. This is how white people are. And then he gets a hold of some readings. And after he does these readings, he's starting to feel like, okay, so I have a counter narrative to the creation story. So whereas he saw white people as always the savior, he got to see how, oh, well, this culture is primitive to this and to that. And then that is the ideal that he begins to adopt. So much so that he goes and he writes an article in the paper, and people are outraged and are responding to him because of this. And so there's a lot going on. And the reason why I say that is because when we think about racism, it is both something that is mentally processed and physically processed. It's a type of trauma. And so one of the things that goes on is all of this emotion that goes on. Like, I am upset about this. I have not been getting a full conversation. I have not been able to experience this or that. And now I am finally being able to hear a counter story, which I feel, which I'm the hero, which I'm the superior one. And so all of this is why it's important for us to even know history in the first place, and not history from a particular lens. There's an African proverb that says, until the lion tells its story, the hunter will always be glorified. And so only hearing one side of the story, when you hear another story, sometimes we don't know what questions to ask. We're just happy that we're hearing another story. And you talked about how his anger was not misplaced.
Mm-hmm.
You were right to be upset. But think about it. In the first couple pages of this chapter, he talks about how where I am originally from, if I would have expressed my anger, that would have been viewed a certain type of way. Are we creating spaces for honest dialogues to happen? That
Mm-hmm.
did not happen. And so he got a hold of a narrative, and then it starts pushing what he now would call anti-white racist ideas around, saying that they are inferior. Going back to chapter 8, this segregationist mindset that says one culture is inferior, one race of people is inferior, one ethnicity is inferior to the next. But that dialogue never happened. Processing that emotion never happened. And so that culture, being proud of who you are and where you come from, then turns into this type of pride that is destructive. And one of the things that he says in this chapter, he says, we must never mistake hatred of white racism for the hatred of white people. We must never attribute the actions of white racists to white people in general. To be anti-racist means that an individual is responsible only for the individual. We must also never confuse anti-racism for anti-white racism. And to kind of like wrap that up into a way that I can easily understand it, it's almost looking at the movie Black Panther as a Black American, right? Like we know who is the prescribed good guy. We say T'Challa is, but we can relate to Killmonger and why he was upset, why he was. We might not agree with how he approached everything, but we can understand it. And if we're not in a position to where we're able to talk about these things and promote policies that help uplift and affirm and create equity and understanding, then it's like what Martin Luther King says. He says he talked about the riots that happened. We see this all the time in history. So I think that that's why this chapter of whiteness is so important. If we talk about rioting being bad, which it is, but we don't talk about the circumstances which create rioting, then that is just as much a sin. And so, how are we having these difficult conversations? And when it comes to racism, a lot of times you might hear Black people say, well, I can't be racist. And this chapter kind of provides a different understanding of that. Because what we usually hear is, well, I'm Black and I can't be racist. And then the next question is, well, why do you say that? Well, because racism is a systematic structure set in place, and you have to have power. And since I don't have collective power and influence, I therefore cannot be racist. But how Dr. Kendi is defining racism, this is why definitions are important. He says it is promoting an racist policy, it's action or inaction that promotes a racist policy, or expresses a racist idea. And so now this understanding of how do I understand the quote unquote other is enlarged, because how do I deal with white power being misused? And then how do I understand white privilege? Because privilege and power are not exactly the same. But those are just some of the things that I got while looking at this chapter on whiteness.
I think you hit on something very interesting when you were talking about when you even brought in chapter 8, and you were mentioning the segregationists and how um, one who has a segregationist mindset, either, it doesn't matter your race, creed, color, ethnicity, but one who promotes or advocates for the separation of cultures or people. And also an inferiority of those of one versus the other, and that they should be eternally separate. I think that I'm I wanted to add to that. I think that a segregationist is not just one who believes that there are superior, um, but also desires to not want to cohabitate or cooperate. So I think what happens is, well, like for example, I was reading this article. I need to find that article so that I can cite it properly. Um, but I was reading an article that was talking about multiracial worship versus multicultural. So
Mm.
multiracial slash multi-ethnic versus multicultural. And this person was actually was saying that he doesn't have a negative, a bad thing against either. He was offering that he was just defining multiracial and multicultural. He was saying that oftentimes people define their churches and as a multicultural church when it may actually be a multiracial church or multi-ethnic church. And he was offering that multicultural churches engage the culture, various cultures of people. And multiracial, you may just have other people of different races on stage, but there is one dominating culture that the Church of Assimilationist has that the culture has a spouse and that one must assimilate to in order to coexist and function day to day in that church. And what I would offer is, and this person he actually said that his church he prefers that his church be multiracial, not necessarily multicultural, because he was saying that the context that he was in, especially in the community, it doesn't fit to have a multicultural context. But what I would offer, especially if we are, if you're a minister, if you're someone who desires to make the world a more equitable place, a more egalitarian world each and every day, I would kind of push against that. If you are ever in a place where you're comfortable with the status quo, comfortable with not pushing people to change or embrace things that are different, I would say that that is a segregationist. Someone who has that has coalesced, or someone who is complacent with keeping things as the way they are, not inviting people to grow and stretch in ways that they haven't done before, not inviting people to embrace the challenge, embrace the difficulty of working with people who are different, not just, wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt, not just voting for a certain policy, but also working with, cohabitating, cooperating with. Go into communities where people don't speak your language. Go do ministry. Go do ministry with people who don't look like you. Go visit a church that or have your church, every once a month or once a quarter or once a year, do some type of activity where they are engaging and they're hearing the voice of God and experiencing a spirituality that engages a culture and language unlike yours. I think that would allow people to see how what we have done, even in the church, is we have correlated God and spirituality with our own senses of our own silos. We're okay with worshiping in this silo, and we think that God is pleased,
Mm.
and it is God's will. I've even heard someone say, "You should come to our church. Our church is like this." I believe when we go to heaven, our church, our heaven is going to be just like our church. See, I find that problematic when we automatically think that our churches or our experiences are the complete infallible experience of God, and they're completely we can't grow, and God is just pleased perfectly with our own experiences, our own worldviews and um, theologies. I think we should all have give room for growth, give room for challenge, give room for working with people who are different. And I think that it may be that inner a latent segregationist within one who espouses I'm not going to change or embrace difference. And there's another thing that you that I wanted to highlight. What Dr. Kendi offers is that anti-racists have to develop a sense of bravery. That like he was talking about how there were some FAMU students who did a march to the White House. They did a sit-in, a peaceful protest that lasted about 24 hours. So they took their anger and they made action. They took action based upon the anger. They weren't directing it at the white race. They were directing it at a specific event, a specific thing that they were upset about. And what he's offering is that anti-racism requires anti-racists to develop some bravery because we have to own the work. And he offers that courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to do what is right in the face of it. There's a anonymous philosopher that he's quoting at that point that he says some of us are restrained by fear of what could happen to us if we resist. Some of us are, on our jobs, in our families, in our churches, in our fraternities or sororities, or in our clubs. We're afraid to speak out or resist against in a peaceful way. Resist against systemic oppression. And he says, in our naivete, we are less fearful of what could happen to us or is already happening to us if we don't resist. So we have to harness bravery and courage as anti-racists.
Yeah. So the thing that I found difficult with this chapter is because a lot of times there's this notion of either you are the straight rebel rouser or you are just the people pleaser trying to get the man to you shucking and jiving type of thing. And so how do we kind of like wrestle with this idea of justice? And we have to actually be able to understand justice and what's going on in order to kind of like move this conversation forward. But that's a very difficult thing because sometimes there's more than one thing that we're facing. Sometimes there's okay, we need to organize so that we get these policies together. But then how do you still deal with this collective hurt and trauma that is that resonates and that oftentimes goes unresolved? So in chapter 10, we're talking about whiteness and how he realizes that he was wrong for like talking about labeling a whole group of people, right? Based off of the actions of some. But then if we go back to what chapter is that? I want to say it's chapter 4 that deals with culture. Is that chapter 4? That might be chapter 7. Yeah, chapter 7 that deals with culture. He talks about how we have this culture to where it is inbred and then it's external, to where people will blame you and say that it's all black people. Or they will see a group of black people and say, this is all black people, especially you. And then when you go places, you have to live up to this standard because you represent the whole race. And so this conversation here kind of like it on the inside of me, I'll just speak for myself. It's almost like there's this inequity that goes on because I know for me in certain settings, I still have to be aware of the biases of others. And I have to courageously know how to navigate those things while I dismantle them. And then the other is, how do I engage this while still providing you a level of grace? Because that's usually what happens. I can't talk about your white privilege because I'm not trying to say that you're a bad person, but these policies, and it's hard to talk about systemic issues and cultural issues that affect one another when I just don't want you to feel bad or uncomfortable. And so now the issue is being nice. But then he goes on in the chapter and he talks about like the difference between what like a white nationalist and a white supremacist, and he talks about how they actually support policies which will also hurt white people.
Right.
And it's not really benefiting them. But there's this segregationist mindset that kind of like separates everything to the degree of somebody is superior and then this group is inferior. And then even one of our presidents, Lyndon B. Johnson, he said it. He said, if you can make the poorest white man think that he's better than the best black man, then they will stay divided.
Right.
So when we talk about white power and white privilege, this is what comes in. A lot of times, black people, we have to confront white privilege, and we're trying to dismantle this white power that keeps other groups oppressed and disenfranchised. But then, if I'm talking to somebody who doesn't experience white power, it's hard for them to understand their privilege. And so, what might a conversation like this looks like? Well, I hear you always talking about race, but my family was poor too. And it's like, being black don't mean that you're poor.
Right.
But if the police come, then, I'm probably going to be the one that gets all the questions because I look like I don't belong in this neighborhood. And so that privilege doesn't manifest itself in material gain, but that still has to be addressed. And so how do we speak to the disparities, but also understand where this stuff comes from? And that's why history is important. When we look at whiteness, this whole idea of race comes about, and it's in the book. But when we look at it, it comes about in the 17th century. And all of Europe wasn't really for it at first. But then when the slave trade gets introduced, then you have more European countries coming together and adopting this identity of whiteness. And that's why race is oftentimes tied together with power, because it was who will be enslaved, who won't be enslaved, who will have access. That's what it was stemming around. But if we go into the history books, we can properly confront this for what it is. And then we can also look at the other thing that society, that our culture, that our race has offered or has created, but we have to be able to look at those ugly points as well.
And I also, there is, I think it's very powerful that you stated the problem of or how the issue of race and dividing people based upon color, how that comes into play, because I think it's important that us as anti-racists, we have to kind of understand, not make the mistake of thinking that that anti-racism is perpetuating that separation or through hatred, but it's actually the opposite. What he says on page 129, there's two paragraphs, so bear with me. I just want to share them with you. There's two paragraphs that say, to be anti-racist is to never mistake the global march of white racism for the global march of white people. To be anti-racist is to never mistake the anti-racist hate of white racism for the racist hate of white people. What he's saying is don't learn to see that see the evil and be able to see evil aside from people. One of my professors said he said, problems are problems and people are people. The mistake that we make is we say that people are problems. But no, problems are problems and people are people. And he continues on to say, to be anti-racist is to never conflate racist people with white people, knowing there are anti-racist whites and racist non-whites. To be anti-racist is to see ordinary white people as the frequent victimizers of people of color and the frequent victims of racist power. Donald Trump's economic policies are geared toward enriching white male power, but at the expense of most of his white male followers. along with the rest of us. We must discern the difference between racist policymakers, and white people. For decades, racist power contributed to stagnating wages, destroying unions, deregulating banks and co-op and corporations, and steering funds for schools into prison and military budgets, policies that have often drawn a backlash from some white people. White economic inequality, for instance, soared to the point that the so called 99 percenters occupied Wall Street in 2011, and Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders ran a popular presidential campaign against the billionaire class in 2016. So he goes on and he talks about how white people benefit from racist policies, though not nearly as much as racist power, and not nearly as much as they could from an equitable society, one where the average white voter could have as much power as super rich white men to decide elections and shape policy. So he's inviting us to see how oppression is it is intersectional. So you have race, gender, and class. You have all of that that is intertwined that makes systemic oppression what it is. I'm glad that you highlighted how there are many white nationalists and white supremacists that, in their naive perception of white power, they will vote against themselves and vote for policies that would oppress other white people, and their misunderstanding and their miseducation and misdistinction between white power and their lack of willingness to see an anti-racist perspective.
Yeah. So Fannie Lou Hamer, she has a quote that said, "Nobody's free until we's all free." And I like how this chapter kind of like goes into how we kind of see that played out and how we continue to wrestle with it, because he talks about how there are like these claims that will justify one inequity over another. So
Mhm.
if there are policies that are disenfranchising the black community, then well, there's some type of excuse to counter it. And then he said that there's this claim of anti-white racism in response to anti-racism. So if I say this, then hold on, I'm gonna give you this rebuttal, because what about me? And then he goes in to say, white racists do not want to define racial hierarchy or policies that yield racial inequities as racist. And white racists can't imagine their lives not being at the focus of a movement. And
Mhm.
so he goes in to say, like, this is as old as the civil rights movement and before. And so
Mhm.
if we say Black Lives Matter, then the response is all lives matter. Or if you talk about police brutality and you talk about Black Lives Matter, then you get this response of Blue Lives Matter. And
Mhm.
it's not because either of those aren't true. All lives matter is a true statement. Blue lives matter is a true statement. But if they matter, then we should also see the inequities that it causes all
Mhm.
around. So if all lives matter, do you see my life when it's not identical to yours and it doesn't put you at the center? We all of a sudden feel left out. And then, but when you are a part of privilege, um, that you really can't, it's not pie. That's the best way I can say it.
Mhm.
like privilege is not pie. Like somebody else getting privilege is not less privilege for you. But
Mhm.
when we are so used to it at the expense of others, then it feels like I am losing something here. But
And then it
how
also means that I have to do work too, because
right.
if I don't do work, then I immediately become complicit. So,
Yeah, so not only do I have to do this work, I don't get to just do what I was doing at first. And
right.
this is and do we have these conversations like with various people? So when I have this with this conversation with some of my white colleagues, what I find out is white people don't have to think about race. Sometimes they say the first time I thought about race, I was 20, I was 30. And so when we talk about whiteness, right, the caucasity, when we talk about that, it's like this whole definition, this whole concept, this is also like a culture shock, because I went from never having to think about it to now I see it everywhere, which could be a lot. And so that's why doing this work of being an anti-racist happens on different levels. But since, we both come from the school of the prophets, we have to talk about this from like the church level. And this is sometimes where we get it wrong. We are so quick to dismiss the difference because we don't want to deal with the tension, that we don't allow the greatness of who God is actually into the place. We don't. So we're neglecting to experience the full grace. So we might say, well, in Christ there is no Jew or Gentile, and yes, I believe that to be a true statement. But that doesn't make as much sense if we don't do the work of understanding how the Jews and Gentiles didn't really mess with each other like that. The Good Samaritan doesn't have the same weight if we don't know how the Jews and Samaritans operated with each other. Like when Jesus heals these lepers and brings them back into community, that doesn't mean as much if we don't understand the culture. Realize when we talk about culture, a lot of times we leave Jesus's culture out of things.
Right.
Jesus was Jewish.
Right.
And we strip that to make it fit like us. Jesus would have looked like me, would have done these things, and that can be very problematic. How do we actually understand that God is the creator of all? And in this, when we acknowledge the differences and bring that in, then we can experience the fullness of God. But a lot of times we rather just kind of cut that off and say, I will bring somebody else that's in that looks different. But how do I actually embrace all of this? And that's why all of these chapters are important, because sometimes it's not just the policy. Sometimes it's the culture. Sometimes it's the behavior. Sometimes it's the body, and how these racist ideas come in. But when you look at whiteness, all of a sudden it trumps that. And how do we create this level of not just equality, right, but equity, which invites various voices in the room and create space at God's table?
And I love how you offered how culture matters, and we forget Jesus' culture. Just a quick reference. There's this book that I'm reading called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, and it talks about how if we don't understand people's or don't seek to try to understand other people's perspective by getting in those contexts with them, the story becomes so whitewashed. A lot of the nutrients, the richness of their story that's healing and nurturing to our souls is washed out because we're seeing it through our lenses. So when you talked about the Good Samaritan, I thought of the Samaritan woman, and when Jesus went to the well, and spoke to the Samaritan woman. There's so much about that we just breeze past. I just want to highlight maybe a few points about that story to kind of offer to you, to invite you to consider how cultural context, getting in those contexts, not just wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt, not just having Black Lives Matter banner outside on your church or your home, or I voted for whoever sign, but also getting into those contexts to attempt to see the world through a different lens. When we look at this narrative of Jesus and the woman in the well, what was so impactful was not that just Jesus told her that if you drink, I have the living water, and if you drink from this water, you'll never get thirsty again. We jump straight to that. We go straight to that. But the whole context was transforming. The fact that she was alone at noon at the well says something about her personality. It says the woman in this story appears at the well alone at noon. Only a bad woman would be so blatant. She is either a social outcast or knows that travelers can be found at the well at noon and wants to contact them. So it says something about who this woman is. Now, it's not a critique. You don't have to critique, but it offers that this woman is making a bold move. And then it says, it says the text assumes that Jesus and the disciples had such a bucket, but the disciples had taken it with them to the city. Jesus could easily have requested that they leave it behind for his use, but he had a plan. So his plan was to, back then, when women go to first of all, they traveled in groups, and they traveled early in the day when men wouldn't be about. They did it in groups, and they did it in a less traffic time. This woman went at noon alone. Jesus, well, men are supposed to wait, let women leave, let the woman leave, and then they come, because it's inappropriate. We leave that. We forget all of that. Not only when Jesus walks up to the well, just walking to the well was Jesus making a bold step. Not saying the prophetic statement, drink of the water, living water. No, 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 no. Just walking into her space. And I think we don't read that because we're not willing to see through someone else's cultural eyes. So when we see that, we see what Christ did was he crossed into a whole new context, and he spoke to someone who was not like him. And I think just that, there's other points that this book offers, but just that point, Jesus' willingness to intentionally break the mold and cross over into this other context, that whole experience was transforming. It was transcending. I believe in my heart of hearts, I believe that Jesus was probably like, oh my gosh, am I going to do this? It wasn't easy. It probably was not easy. It probably was not comfortable to do that,
Yeah.
you know. So I think that whenever we're having such conversations, like being an anti-racist and doing the work of anti-racism, it's going to require us going into contexts that we're not comfortable, cooperating and working with people that are uncomfortable, not just asking, who am I supposed to vote for? What am I supposed I got this, asking your black friend what to do, or how do I be an ally? None of that is doing the work of anti-racism, really being uncomfortable. Even myself, I'm crossing over, and there's a lot of xenophobias and things that I'm shedding away, a lot of distrust and skepticism that God is shedding away off me, that me going over into other contexts, me listening and having, even as a minister, me talking with people one-on-one who are different and getting to know them and hear their narrative, that helps me to see other people in different eyes. I would invite you to do the work of anti-racism, to be courageous. But did you have any other closing words or?
Yeah, like so. What I see, Christy, she responded. Michelle Alexander goes deep into how whites are the victimizers and the victims in her The New Jim Crow. It's fascinating. The New Jim Crow deals with like the prisoner pipeline system. That is a phenomenal book. So yeah, check that out too. But one of the things with what you were saying about like addressing this whiteness that came to my mind is I hear it a lot. You might hear people like religious people say this: it's not a skin problem, it's a sin problem. And I agree with that. But I agree with that as much as if I was having to look at a paper and I see the thesis and I didn't get to the body, or the abstract and didn't even get to the body of work. So you identified the problem, but like let us go back to Christ. Jesus saw it was a sin problem, not a skin problem, and he was willing to confront the ideology and to contest the hegemony. He was willing to actually touch people's skin who had leprosy, but we don't even want to touch the issue. We
And know
just
that that was socially uncomfortable, not just biologically. That was socially uncomfortable to do that. So it's a
and
lot of social things we're going to, discomfort.
right. So as we do this work, when we take up our cross and walk, that taking up the cross is not just admitting where you were wrong and confessing your sin, but it's also committing to do the work, to do all the good you can, in all the ways you can, in all the places you can, as long as ever you can. Come on, John Wesley, come on in here. Let's bring them in.
Come on in here.
But doing this work and being able to call it out courageously, like, oh, I know what I see, this, I know what I'm looking at, I know what this is, and being informed enough to where you can have that conversation, so that you can do justice. But having enough humility, what did you call it? Cultural humility?
Yes, cultural humility. Yeah.
Cultural humility, so that we can walk humbly, love mercy.
Now you're preaching.
And we can't do those things unless we actually confront those things on different levels, because it's a skin problem and a sin problem. That is true, but it's not just personal. This manifests itself institutionally, culturally, communally, and we have to be able to allow God's presence to permeate those things as well, because a lot of times it's lived out in policies. And he says this on 133. He says, where he learned about the FAMU experiences, he said, going after white people instead of racist powers prolongs the policy harming black life. In the end, anti-white racist ideas, in taking some or all of the focus off racist power, become anti-black. In the end, hating white people becomes hating black people, which goes back to what Fannie Lou Hamer said: nobody's free until we're all free. And so we have to be able to address the issue at the root, and not just coming at whatever we can finally release the energy on. Because the energy, the emotions, the hurt, that is okay. You're not wrong for that. But if it's misguided, then it's misdirected, and it has no social power or influence. And that's what we want this to do, so that we're creating policies and societies, churches that are not just equal, but also equitable and practical and uplifting to God's creation.
Wow. I hope my brother's preaching transformed you as much as it transformed me. We want to invite you to, as we come to a close, we want to invite you to join us next week, next Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, right here. We're going to engage in reading chapter
11.
Blackness.
Blackness.
Black.
All right, but before we get out of here, it's March. This is our first time in March. March is Women's History Month. Shout out to all the dope women out there doing your thing, who are making history, who made history. We would not be here if it wasn't for you. So
Christy,
Women's History Month.
Mo, our technical director.
Mo, our technical director, the president of Gammon Theological Seminary. Come on now. Russ College president.
Great.
Black history, women's history. It's all coming together. We love you, ladies. We love you.
Thank you so much for your presence, for being the progenitors of life. We don't have life without, the women's divine ability to birth life. Of course, we know that it takes the contributions of both the divine masculinity and the divine femininity. But we thank you, women, just for your ability to bear, to harbor and nurture life and birth it. And you deserve honor, and you deserve so much love for just existing, just for being such a divine created being. But thank you all for joining us in this conversation, how to be an anti-racist. We want to invite you to invite your church members, to invite all your clubs that you're in, all your organizations you're in, your friends, your family. Maybe there's that one person that you want to grow and learn with, and you want to invite them. We want to invite you to join us as we're growing and learning too.
Come
Um,
on in the room.
Come on in the room. So God bless you. And did you want to give any shout outs?
I think we gave all the shout outs. Just come see us next Thursday to continue this dialogue. We appreciate you.
All right, y'all be blessed. Peace.
Peace.